Hey Brody, so these are 7 self-improvement concepts that will change your life, starting with 1. So sometimes you're having a conversation with somebody and you know you're in the right, but you still lose the argument. So this is when I was still hanging out with friends that would smoke weed. And there was one time I was at my friend's house and we were just in his bedroom and he said something along the lines of, I smoke weed before bed because it helps me sleep better, so weed is good for sleep. And I knew he was objectively wrong because I read the literature on what cannabis does to your brain. And the current consensus from the literature, to my understanding, is cannabis will help you fall asleep quicker, but the problem with it is it disrupts your REM sleep cycle. But because he was better at arguing than me, he wasn't actually right. He technically won the argument because I didn't know how to poke holes in what he was saying. So this is where Socratic questioning comes into play, and this was invented by Socrates, and it's basically a line of dialogue that you can use to get to the bottom of someone's argument. And when you understand how to use Socratic questioning, you're going to be able to hold your own in an argument. So before I even tell you what Socratic reasoning is, you need to understand what an argument actually is. I promise this will all make sense if you continue watching. So the argument I gave earlier can be split into 3 pieces. So the first part of the argument is, I smoke weed before bed. That would be the claim. Because it helps me sleep better, that's the premise. So that's basically the grounds of the argument, the evidence per se. And then, so weed is good for sleep, that's the conclusion. That's like the point of the argument. And so if you're trying to use Socratic questioning, you want to continually keep questioning the premise of the argument because that's the grounds of the argument. So if you can actually see if what the evidence is true or false, then you can understand if the argument is true or false. So if I time traveled back to that situation and he said his argument, which is, I smoke weed before bed because it helps me sleep, and that means weed is good, I would question the premise. So I would say, okay, so how does weed make you sleep better? And he might say something along the lines of, because it helps me fall asleep faster. And then I would question, how does that make your sleep quality better? He would probably just say, it helps me fall asleep faster, so it helps me sleep better. And that's the root of the argument. He thinks that because he perceives himself falling asleep faster, he thinks that means he sleeps better. Yeah, my sinuses are wild right now, dude. I'm pissed. When I was in high school, I was always the kid who kept to himself, and even when I went out, I graduated and I got my first job, I would give one-word answers to customers, and I would just try to avoid conversation as much as possible. But there was one day where I got this book called Psycho-Cybernetics, and I read it in my bedroom like you do, and it made me realize that there's things that you can believe that they're not even true, but because you believe them, you act like it's true. And there's a really good quote that I think encapsulates this, which is, if you fight for your limitations, you get to keep them. I think it's by Jim Kiwick or something. I don't know if I'm saying that right. So you're going to have your own limiting beliefs that are holding you back. And the best way that you can actually drill through these and get to the bottom of them so you don't have to deal with them anymore is by journaling about them. And the funny thing is, once you realize what these beliefs are, you can use Socratic questioning on these beliefs to actually get to the root cause of them. So I think that's probably the best thing you could do. And when you do that, you can replace those limiting beliefs with supporting beliefs that are going to support your future success. And when I realized, me believing because I was an introvert, I was bound to be socially incompetent, that's when I realized oh, this is stupid, and I can actually just become charismatic. This is a skill that I can learn, if I want to. That's when I was able to develop my social skills and start making actual good connections with people. So I learned this from this book called How to Lie with Statistics, and this is a really good book if you're trying to see through clever marketing that uses weird statistics to get you to buy things. And there's one thing with statistics that I think is really useful to know from this book that I see used a lot now that I understand this. So imagine that there's a company with 10 employees, okay? And this is a hypothetical example of what their yearly earnings would look like. So if the company was advertising what their average employee would make a year, they could legally say that their average employee makes $171,000 a year. But that's obviously not a fair representation of what the average employee makes in that company. And the reason that they can get away with this is because average technically has 3 different types of averages. So there's the mean, which is the arithmetic mean. So you basically add everything up and then divide it by the quantity, which is what they did there. There's the median, which is it's the number in between everybody. And then there's the mode, which is the most common number in the data set. So just being aware that if you see average reported anywhere, you should be a little bit suspicious and be like, okay, what do they actually mean? What type of average do they mean from that? So the first year of my self-improvement journey, I was trying to, in a sense, basically replace bad behaviors with good behaviors. That put very simply. And when you're doing that, there is a level of pain, because I'm not a neuroscientist here, so bear with me, but what I think is happening, maybe this is like bro science, but the neural circuits in your brain that carry out like playing video games or doing, let's put simply, like instant gratification behaviors, they're very reinforced. They're strong, okay? And the circuits for hard behaviors that you should do, like reading a book or just working or something like that, they're weak. These are connections that are not very well developed. So what that means is when you're trying to adopt good habits from bad habits, you need the circuits for your bad habits to literally die, and you need the circuits for good habits to get stronger. And I'm assuming that causes genuine neurological pain, because your brain always wants to follow the path of least resistance, because it's usually just cheaper to do that. So when I was trying to make that transition from good to bad habits, and you probably relate to this too, there's a level of pain involved there. And that pain pushes you to go back to your old ways. And you've probably heard the quote, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And what I think that actually means when you're trying to adopt good behaviors over bad behaviors is you need to have a purpose that outweighs the pain of making that transition. So the way that I was actually able to justify me going through the pain of not doing the bad habits was by creating what is called an action board. So I'm not going to go into super depth, but it's basically a vision of what you want your life to look like in like 7 years or so. And I can make a full tutorial if you guys ask for it in the comments, but in the description, I'll have like a Google document that you can make a copy of, and you can make your own action board based on what I have like on the template there. And when I had that vision of exactly what I wanted, it gave me a reason to go to the gym every day. It gave me a reason to justify doing the hard work and stop doing the things I shouldn't be doing. By the way, if you like watching these videos, I ask that you just scroll down and click on the subscribe button so that you can watch more videos like this in the future. So the first like 6 or 8 months of me making YouTube videos, my progress was actually pretty stagnant, and you can't see it because I enlisted a lot of the videos, but I was uploading like every single day, and the problem was I just wasn't making much progress. But there's this one book I was reading called The Diary of a CEO, and one of the chapters, it goes over what is called the Kaizen system. So the example that's used in a book is how Toyota bought out General Motors' worst car factory in America. And this was Toyota's first factory that was outside of Japan, I think. So this was a pretty big deal and also a pretty big risk for them. And so what Toyota did was they did other things, like they adjusted how the hierarchy worked in the car factory, but one of the most trademark things that Toyota did, which has basically become an industry standard, is they would collect ideas from every single worker, including the people on the factory line. And I think within 1 year, Toyota, they had implemented like 10,000 ideas, In Toyota, they bought out the factory, but it was still co-owned by General Motors. And that ended up being the best car factory that General Motors owned in the country. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you look for ideas that you can consistently implement into your life every single day, you're going to incrementally become better and better, faster and faster. So the way that I do this is before I go to bed, I force myself to come up with at least one idea that will benefit my life in some manner. So it could be something involving the gym, it could be involving my YouTube channel, it could be something. And the thing is, I'll just stack up a bunch of those ideas, and every week or so, I'll look through all of them and make sure I'm actually implementing them. And I actually have a full video that explains that system in the cards here if you're interested in it. And in the description, there's going to be a Notion document to like an inbox template that I use to sort all of those ideas. And when I realized the fastest way to actually improve was just by focusing on these 1% improvements, that's when I was able to break the rut I was in on my YouTube channel. So I used to talk to myself in a very detrimental way. So for example, when I was still going to high school, if I got a bad grade, I would let it get to my head and think of it as a reflection of my capability as a person. And on the flip side, if I got a good grade, I would kind of brush it off and be like, oh, this was expected. And I wouldn't even like congratulate myself for it. And maybe that was because I was too perfectionistic at the time, but because of that habitual way of thinking, no matter how well or bad I did in school, it just never felt rewarding. It didn't feel like it was worthwhile. But there were honestly some classes where I did enjoy to do the work, and I think it was because the teacher was using something called positive reinforcement. So when I got handed back a math test and the teacher complimented me on how he could tell I did better on this test than the last test because I studied more, that would encourage me to study more again in the future. But on the flip side, this is kind of ridiculous now that I think about it. The whole 13 years of me being in the public school system, all of my English teachers were absolute to me. And across all the years I was going to school, my English grades definitely suffered because of that, despite me being like at least competent in English. Like, I don't think that it's a weak point for me. And if you're watching this video, in a weird way, we're having a conversation. Like, I can't hear what you're saying, but when I say stuff to you, you do have like this internal monologue that you are responding to what I'm saying and you're processing it with that. The point I'm trying to make is that because you can already talk to yourself, like you can talk to yourself without moving your mouth, you can positively reinforce yourself. So very simply, like if you make the slightest amount of progress, if you look at it with the mindset like, oh, this is better than I did the last time, that's amazing, and you congratulate yourself for that, and you also at the same time, if you make a mistake, you're like, oh, you know, mistakes are gonna happen, and this is going to help me get better for the next time. That's going to positively reinforce you to keep leaning into those mistakes and keep making progress. And when I started to positively reinforce myself for even the slightest bit of improvement, that's when I was able to make the most progress across like basically every single domain in my entire life, like the gym, YouTube, everything. All right, so obviously this is on a different day. So I was editing this and the recording was just messed up. So coming back here is not an excuse to not upload. So I'm recording this segment. Hair in my mouth. Ew. This is one of the most impactful transformations that I've ever had in my social life because I used to talk without thinking through my sentences. I wouldn't really think about the words I was using, and basically my speech was very messy. And the funny thing is, this is such a common way to speak that I didn't even really stand out for talking like this because everyone else is just as bad as I was. But the problem with being a bumbling idiot is that if you can't clearly translate your ideas and your thoughts into words, nobody wants to listen to you. There's a very powerful quote from Jordan Peterson, who I think is exceptionally articulate, and he says that the most dangerous person is one who is articulate. And I've been on both sides of that coin now, because I used to be a bumbling idiot, and now, because I've developed my ability to articulate what I'm thinking. This has changed my life in so many ways. I get more opportunities from people, I get more respect from people, and the funny thing is, I can't even really articulate how much of an impact this has on my life, because your social skills are so important to so many different domains that it's hard to quantify how much of an impact it really has. So there's two practices that I found extremely helpful towards becoming more articulate that I think you'll also find success with if you implement these. So the first practice is filling a page every single morning. And when you do this, you just want to write down what you're thinking. You don't need to really bother yourself too much about the content that you're writing about, but when you write, you're going to be more conscious about what you're writing, and you're going to think like, oh, this isn't really clear. If I was reading this from somebody else's perspective, I wouldn't really understand what I'm trying to say here. And just through just writing that and like crossing stuff out and rephrasing it in a way that makes more sense, you're going to become instinctually more articulate. And the second practice that I found super helpful, which you can do real time, is listening to the end of every single word. This makes you pronounce clearer and also think about what words you're using much more delicately. So you want to be articulate, so I suggest that you do those practices for 30 days in a row. That's it. Like seriously, you're going to miss some days, but as long as you try to stay somewhat consistent with it for 30 days, you don't even need to do it after a month, because your baseline of articulacy, I guess, is going to be elevated to a point that you're going to be content with it. And you're going to be so ahead of the curve compared to most people that honestly, it's not that much of an advantage if you continue to progress it. In those two practices, that's what I did for like 30 days. And that's why I'm articulate. I'm probably more articulate than 95% of people. I'm not saying that arrogantly. I think it's just true. And because of that, I instantly get respect from people when I speak, because they can tell I have a clear and articulated message to tell them. I hope that I could help you get 1% better today.